It's all about Jesus. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Our defender, the invited guest, friend of the outcast, bread of life. Do you realize how much of the four Gospels, the four perspectives of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are focused on this 1 week? 1/3 of Matthew, as Greg said, 21 to 28. 1/3 of Mark, 1/4 of Luke, and almost half of John's Gospel is all focused on this 1 week. In fact, 1/3 of John's Gospel deals with just the 1 day from the time of crucifixion back to the Last Supper. 1/3 of it deals with 1 day. So it's quite obvious that it's an extremely important time in history and in the life of Jesus. And how does this week affect our lives? It's super, super important. And during this important time, during this important period of history, Jesus didn't leave any doubt at all about what he came to do. He came to die. Plain and simple, he came to die. He tells his disciples repeatedly that this is the case. The first time occurs in Mark chapter 8, which is where we'll be today. Mark chapter 8, verse 31, 32. Jesus says this, reads like this: Jesus began then to teach them, his disciples, to teach his followers, that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed after 3 days and rise again. He spoke plainly about this. Then again, Mark chapter 9 reads like this. He was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and then after 3 days he will rise again. But just in case the disciples have missed it, or maybe we have missed it, Jesus repeats it again in chapter 10, in verse 32. It says, they were on their way to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Now, they were astonished and afraid most likely because, number one, they've got a bad reputation now. Jesus is being hunted, basically, and he was doing all kinds of signs and miracles. So the disciples were astonished, but everybody else following was afraid because, if you're linked up with Jesus, you might get wiped out too. So he took the 12 aside, and he told them what was going to happen to him. Jesus said, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and to the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise. And this time, so Jesus is giving us a few more details than he had previously. And he's told for the first time that his death will be in Jerusalem, and that both the Jews and the Gentiles will reject him. See, chapter 8 only speaks of the Jewish religious leaders, and chapter 9 speaks more generally about being delivered into the hands of men. Chapter 8 said he will be rejected by the priests and the scribes, but now he reveals that they will condemn him to death in chapter 10. And this legal term, and as Greg talked about, he was tried, he was accused and tried. This legal term indicates that he will be tried and executed within the criminal justice system of the day. His depiction of the final days also becomes very more graphic and very more violent. They will mock him, they will spit on him, they will flog him, and they will kill him. Now, if you've ever read some of the rules about, actually it's a Jewish thing. It starts in I think, Deuteronomy 25. This flogging thing is nasty. Nasty. You can die from flogging with the whips and the pieces of bone that were attached to it. I don't want to get into that. It's a little bit gruesome. But Jesus predicted his death 3 times in just 3 chapters here. And he knew that his death was not incidental to his mission. Instead, it was absolutely central to both his identity and to his purpose here on earth. But the major difference, the major advance in Mark 10 is for the first time Jesus tells us not only that he will die, but why he will die. He tells us why he will die here. Mark 10:45, it says, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus Christ did not come to be served. He did not come to be served, but to die and to give his life. And that sets him apart from the founder of every other major religion. Their purpose was basically to live and to be an example, to tell you good things. Jesus' purpose was to die and to be a ransom, a sacrifice, Jesus the sacrifice, as well as to be an example on how to live. And there are really two important aspects to Jesus' sacrifice that we're going to look at today. Number one, or first off, Jesus was a willing sacrifice. Say he was a willing sacrifice. He was a willing sacrifice, and number two, he was a humble sacrifice. Say he was a humble sacrifice. So he was willing. Jesus was willing. When we look at this verse and it says the word come, when he chose the word come, in this verse it is a strong giveaway that Jesus existed before he was born here on earth. It says he came into this world. He came into this world, which means like he was somewhere else before he came here, right? So, for example, you guys were all at home before you came into church. And by saying he did not come to be served, there's also an assumption that he had every right to expect to be honored and to be served himself, and yet he did not even exercise that privilege like most of us would. The final phrase, to give his life as a ransom for many, sums up the reason why he had to die. He came to be a substitutionary sacrifice. Jesus came to be a substitutionary sacrifice. His sacrifice paid the price to free us from sin and also to secure a victory over death, hell, and the grave. So if you consider this little preposition for in the phrase a ransom for many, it's actually more like instead of, in place of, or substitute in the Greek. The Greek word for is like this long, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. It's ridiculous. But what about the word ransom? In English, we don't even use this word anymore. We don't even use it anymore nowadays, except in relation to a kidnapping. But here in the Gospel of Mark, he uses a Greek word which meant to buy the freedom of a slave or a prisoner. And you'll often see when you're reading through the New Testament that the New Testament writers use a term, a slave to sin. So the ransom would have to be a huge, huge sacrificial payment that matched the value or paid the debt of a slave or a prisoner or prisoners in order to procure or secure their freedom. So what is Jesus saying here? He's saying that he came to make that sacrifice, to pay that ransom, but since the slavery that Jesus is dealing with is sort of like, if you want to call it a cosmic kind of slavery, if you will, a cosmic evil, then that requires what I would call a cosmic payment. So Jesus is saying, I will pay the ransom that you could not possibly even consider paying, and it will give you your freedom. And that payment was Jesus' death on the cross. And I've got to tell you, for anybody that even thinks about it, I mean, most of us Christians, we're just like, the word says it, I believe it, and that's it. But if you start thinking about this thing, just imagining this is really hard for you if you're among those who struggle with the teaching about the cross. And I know I do, and I still do. I think about this a lot. Even if you watch a more visual interpretation, did anybody see the Passion movie with Jim Caviezel? I mean, my wife won't even watch it. It's brutal. So even it's more difficult if you watch a visual interpretation of this or if you think about what Jesus went through for us. And it's somewhat natural to assume that Scripture, and emphasizing so much about this week, it's just giving us one more example of an ancient, primitive, bloodthirsty, small g gods that are worshipped by ancient, primitive, bloodthirsty species. I mean, if you can think that way. For example, in the Iliad by Homer, some of you may have read that book in high school or college, maybe not. Probably a better example would be if you saw the movie Troy with Brad Pitt. That's probably more likely where you would find this. But in the book Iliad by Homer, King Agamemnon didn't get fair winds to sail to Troy to recapture his brother's wife until he sacrificed his eldest daughter. When he made the sacrifice of his eldest daughter, then it appeased the wrath of the gods, and then the gods let him sail to Troy. And that's how it went up until, Jesus' time. You think, the gods are ruling and all this stuff. So what Jesus said here is, I came to give my life as a ransom. And it may just seem to be another variation on that theme, that the gods are in control, and they're bloodthirsty, they're savages. It's an ancient culture. It's ruled by an irritable God who's demanding blood sacrifices for the release of innocent slaves and prisoners. But that's not what's going on here at all. And unless you understand this, you won't understand God. And this is a problem for many people, because they might say, well, if God is really a loving God, then why doesn't God just forgive everybody? It'd be so much simpler, right? I forgive you. Everybody, you're all set free. You can come to heaven with me. Why did Jesus have to go through this terrible suffering into death? Another good question. Why did he have to sacrifice himself and be a ransom? All good questions, logical questions. Well, here's the beginning of the answer. Jesus didn't have to die despite God's love. He had to die because of God's love. And it had to be this way because all of life-changing love is a substitutionary sacrifice. I'll say it again. All life-changing love is a substitutionary sacrifice. If you think about it this way. If you love a person whose life is all put together and has no major needs, it costs you nothing, right? Time with them is delightful. They're easy to be with. And there may be one or two people like that in your life that you know. If there is, stay friends with them because they're good to hang out with. They don't have any needs. They won't suck the life out of you. But if you try to love somebody who has needs, someone who's in trouble or who is persecuted or who is emotionally wounded, it's going to cost you, right? It's going to cost you some way, shape, or form. You can't love those people without taking a hit yourself. There must be a transfer of some kind. There must be a transfer of some. It's required so that somehow their troubles or their problems get transferred onto you. It's because of that love, not despite that love. My friends, there's a lot of wounded people out there, and you may be one. I got issues too. They're emotionally sinking, they're hurting, they're desperately needing to be loved. And that's okay. 99.98% of humans have major issues, and 100% of us are flawed. Can you say amen? There is no perfect people, right? There are no perfect people here. No perfect people. And sometimes when needy people are with you, you look at your watch and you want to make a little graceful exit. Oh, I gotta go. Because listening to them with all their problems can be grueling, right? It can be exhausting to be a friend to a needy or damaged person. Again, we are all jacked up or flawed in some way, shape, or form. But the only way that a needy or emotionally damaged person is going to start filling up and healing emotionally is if somebody loves them. And the only way to love them is to let yourself be emotionally drained, and we need to follow the example of Jesus, who was a willing sacrifice. All life-changing love is substitutionary sacrifice. Some of your fullness is going to have to go into them. And you have to empty yourself out to some degree. If you hold on to your emotional comfort and simply avoid people, people are going to sink. So the only way to love them is, again, through substitutionary sacrifice. All life-changing love is substitutionary sacrifice. Let me give you probably a more dramatic example, and that example is parenting. Parenting. When you have young children, they're in a constant state of dependency, right? Constant state. They have so many needs they just can't stand on their own, and they will not just grow out of that dependency automatically. The only way that your children will grow beyond their dependency into self-sufficient adults is for you to essentially abandon your own independence for 20 years or so, or in some cases 30 years or so, or in some cases 40 years or so, right? So when they are young, for example, you've got to read to them and read to them and read to them. Otherwise, they won't develop intellectually. Lots of their books, of course, are really boring to you, except for Dr. Seuss. Man, I love Dr. Seuss. God, I don't like Green Eggs and Ham, Hop on Pop, all those, Go Dog Go. Those books are good. I can read those. Some of them you're like, but you have to read to them. And then you have to listen to your children. And keep listening, and keep listening, and keep listening, because they say all kinds of things that make absolutely no sense, and it's less than scintillating conversation for us adults. So what is SpongeBob up to now? You got to learn all about Pokemon, I don't know, how's Peppa Pig? I don't know, we got to learn all these things. And then there's dressing, there's bathing, there's feeding, there's teaching them to do things for themselves, all these things. In addition to that, psychological statistics show that children need about 5 positive affirmation statements for every statement of criticism that they hear from you. 5 to 1. Remember that, young parents. 5 to 1. My childhood was exactly opposite. How about yours? What, you got a B? You couldn't get an A? What, English too hard for you, David? Come on. Well, you only scored 1 touchdown? Couldn't you do 2? What'd you do there? I got to get it together here. Hold on, I'm going back. I'm regressing. I got to compose myself. See how far off we go? It's real easy. Unless you sacrifice much of your freedom. I had a rough childhood, people. No, it was good. Unless you sacrifice much of your freedom and a good bit of your time, your children will not grow up healthy and equipped to function. They just won't. And unfortunately, there's plenty of parents out there who just won't do it. Have you noticed? I spent a long time teaching children. There's a lot of parents out there that just don't want to, take the time to teach their kids and live with their kids. They won't disrupt their lives that much. They won't pour themselves into their kids. They just won't. They just won't make the sacrifice. I don't know. And their kids will grow up physically. They'll grow up physically, but they're still children emotionally. They're needy. They are vulnerable. They are dependent. And you can think about it this way. Either you make the sacrifice or they're going to make the sacrifice. Either you suffer temporary in some way, shape, or form, or in a redemptive way, or they're going to suffer in a wasteful and destructive way. It's just the way it is. It's at least partly up to you. But all real life-changing love is substitutionary sacrifice. Here's an example I read from National Geographic magazine. I got to hold it together for this one. There was a forest fire in Yellowstone National Park, and some forest rangers began a trek up the mountain to survey the damage. And one park ranger found a bird of which nothing was left but a carbonized, petrified shell covered in ashes, and it was huddled at the base of a tree. And somewhat sickened by this freaky sight of just this petrified bird, the ranger took a stick and he poked the bird and knocked it over. And when the petrified bird fell over, 3 little tiny chicks come running out from underneath the bird, from the dead mother's wings. It's evident that when the forest fire arrived, the mother had remained steadfast instead of running. She just stood there and huddled over her chicks. Because she had been willing to die, those under the cover of her wings lived. And it reminds me so much of what Jesus said in Luke 13:34, where he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you that kill the prophets, you that stone those who were sent to you, how often I would just want to gather you up together as children, as a hen gathers up chicks under her wings." It reminds me of that story. And Jesus did indeed gather all of Jerusalem's children up under his wings. And again, all of life-changing love is a costly substitutionary sacrifice. And why is a story like this so emotional? It's just a bird. It's just a bird. Because we know from experience, from the mundane to the dramatic, that sacrifice is at the heart of real love. Sacrifice is at the heart of real love. We know, you all know that anybody who has ever done anything for you that has made a difference for you, a parent, a teacher, a mentor, a friend, a spouse, that person sacrificed for you in some way. They stepped in, they accepted hardship so that we wouldn't get hit with it ourselves. They stepped in and helped some way. So it makes sense that a God who is way, way more loving than both you and I or any of us, a God who comes into the world to deal with the ultimate evil, the ultimate sin, would have to make a substitutionary sacrifice. He couldn't just say, "I forgive you." Even us flawed human beings know that you can't just overlook evil. It has to be dealt with. It has to be removed or healed just by saying forget about it. It just can't be done that way. It must be paid for, and dealing with it is costly. It's costly. It's going to cost you some way, shape, or form. How much more should we expect? How much more should we expect that God couldn't just shrug off evil? The debt had to be paid. But he was so incredibly loving that he was willing to die in order to do it himself. And this is where the God of the Bible is so radically different from the mythical gods of old. The ancients understood the idea of the wrath of God. They understood the idea of justice, the idea of a death as a necessary punishment or payment, but they had no idea that God would come and pay for it himself. And the cross is and was the substitutionary sacrifice of God. That possibility would never have even entered into the mind of Homer, who wrote the Iliad, in a million years. Would have never entered into his mind, let alone, it didn't even enter the imagination of the 12 guys that were with him or the rest of the disciples that are around Jesus. The only way that God could redeem us was to give his life, which was a life of immeasurable worth, as a ransom. He just couldn't say, I just forgive everybody. He just couldn't say that. It doesn't work that way. There had to be a debt paid. There had to be a ransom paid. In the creation, God could say, let there be light, and there was light. He could say, let there be vegetation, and there was vegetation. He could say, let there be sun, moon, and stars, and then there was sun, moon, and stars. But he could not say, let there be forgiveness. It's just not the way forgiveness works. It is always costly. Forgiveness is always costly. It's always going to cost someone. Yeah, God created the world in an instant. Created it in an instant. It was a beautiful process. But he recreated the world on the cross, and it was a horrible, horrible process. Horrible process. It's just how it works. Love that changes things, all love that changes things, is substitutionary sacrifice. So Jesus was indeed a willing sacrifice, willing to pay the price, to be the ransom, and to give his life of immeasurable worth. But he was also a humble sacrifice. Say he was a humble sacrifice. Willing and humble. And you would think that after 3 years of hanging out with Jesus, that by this time the disciples and everybody else that followed him might have grasped the reason that Jesus had come, and the reason was that he was going to suffer and die. After all, he told them enough times. We looked at the verses that we saw earlier. Mark records, he said that he spoke plainly about this. But in the following story, it becomes clear that this is definitely not the case amongst the disciples. Just before, as Britt read the story, just before Jesus and his disciples entered into Jerusalem for the final time, the brothers, James and John, the sons of thunder, and the other people following Jesus were hearing again for at least the third time about his impending and necessary death. And immediately, this is crazy, immediately these two disciples had a request for Jesus after hearing that he's going to die the third time. Mark 10:35 up on the screen. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. They came to Jesus and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." And Jesus said, "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" And James and John, come on, man. "We want you to do, teacher, for us whatever we ask." That's a great way to start a prayer with the Lord of hosts, right? With your Savior. Hey, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Full of humility, right? "Oh, Lord, I have a humble request. I want you to do exactly as I say." Not so much. Jesus, of course, responds very graciously. It's just the way he was. He responds very graciously. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asks. What Jesus doesn't say, the humble servant, is, "Would you think about starting that prayer over again, boys?" Or he doesn't say, "How dare you talk to me like that? Don't you know who I am? I'm going to die for you in about 3 days. Don't you know who you are? You're just humble servant." He simply says, "What do you want?" Awesome. Don't you just love Jesus, how he just handles this stuff? Verse 7, and they replied, "Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory." Jesus said, "You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? So they come with a proposition. Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. What are they thinking of here? To them, in your glory means when you're seated on your throne. It makes sense. In which case, the person on the left would be like the chief of staff, and the person on the right would be like the prime minister. James and John are saying this. When you take power, Jesus, we would like the top places in your cabinet. We don't even know why you're here, but we want the top places in your cabinet. Here's the irony of the request. What was Jesus' moment of greatest glory? And where does Jesus most show forth his glory of God's justice? And where does he reveal the most profound moment of the glory of God's love? On the cross. So when Jesus is at the actual moment of his greatest glory, there will be somebody on the right, there will be somebody on the left, but they will be criminals being crucified. So Jesus says to James and John up here, you guys have no idea what you're asking. And they didn't, obviously. Jesus also, he talks to them about the cup and the baptism, and to put it simply, in the Hebrew scriptures, the cup is almost always a metaphor for the judgment of God against evil. Occasionally it speaks about the cup of blessing, but it is almost always a metaphor for the judgment of God against evil. And also Jesus uses the word baptism here in a sense of an overwhelming experience, an immersion. And what Jesus is telling these two guys is saying, I am satisfying that judgment. I am going to drink that cup. I'm going to be immersed and bridge the gap and defeat death, hell, and the grave. And I will take that last judgment on all of human evil. I will take the overwhelming experience of being condemned so that you guys and us guys can all be free from condemnation. But they still don't get it. The story continues, Mark 38 through 45. Jesus said, you guys don't know what you're asking. He said, can you drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? What did they say? Yeah, we can. They answered, and Jesus, man, they have no idea, right? They answered, and Jesus said to them, yes, you will drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with. James, in Acts chapter 5 or 6, had his head cut off. Yep. And John eventually was, exiled to the island of Patmos, where he died a natural death after being boiled in oil and flogged and a bunch of other stuff. So they did suffer a lot. And Jesus said, you will drink the cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. But to sit at my right hand or my left hand is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. Could be Pastor Dan. Could be Pastor Ken, the right and left hand. I don't know. It's definitely not me. So when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Obviously, so would I, wouldn't you? What are you doing? Jesus called them together and said, you guys know, come on, everybody here. You guys know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials, their politicians, all those guys exercise authority over them. But what? Not so with you. Everybody say, not so with you. Everybody say, not so with me. Not so with me. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your what? Servant. And whoever wants to be first must be what? Slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, again, as we saw, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. For the disciples, again, this is another lesson on substitutionary sacrifice. But when we read this, we're not supposed to say, how can these fools keep missing it? What we're supposed to say is, what are we missing right now? You got to put yourself in their place. What are we missing? How come, if they didn't get it, would we get it? Probably not. What are we missing? So when we see how James and John respond, and we realize how hard it is for anybody to take in the magnitude of the cross and what it really means, when we can understand this, then we will really be on our way to attaining the gift of humility and understanding it and becoming a servant and serving others. At some level, our normal assumptions, our pride, and our egotistical way of thinking basically blind us to the truth of the cross. One prime example of this is worry. Naturally, again, as I said earlier, if you love people, you're going to worry about them. You're going to always be concerned about them. But do you know where constant worry comes from? Constant worry comes and is rooted really in arrogance. And what I mean by that, don't take it wrong. What I mean by that, this arrogance assumes that I know the way my life has to go. I know the way that my kids' lives have to go. And it's not going the way I think it's supposed to be going. God is not getting it right. So when you're worrying about things like that, it's really in a root of arrogance. You're thinking that you know God's plan better than God's plan. You don't know where your kids are going to go. You know what He has planned for him. Seek God's plan. Real humility means to relax. Real humility means to laugh at yourself. Laugh at yourself, guys. We do stupid things. Real humility means to be self-critiquing. Understanding the cross will bring that kind of humility into our lives. But He said, relax. When Jesus sees that His followers still don't get what He came to do, He gathers them together, and He goes, you know that those who rule over you, they're politicians, those high authorities, they exercise authority over you. Not so with you, He said. It's not how you're supposed to be. Jesus is talking basically here about how people try to influence society today, how they try and get their way. They lord it over others. They seek power and control. Because, hey, if I got the power, if I got the wealth, if I have the connections, then I can get my way. What Jesus says here, again, not so with you. When He says it, what do you think He means? Is He saying we have to withdraw and have nothing to do with society? By no means. No, we do not withdraw and have nothing to do with society. We get God's plan and we push forward, right? Actually, the principle that he's drilling on here comes from the book of the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 29. And just a quick story. The Israelite nation had been destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, and many of the people had been forced and taken to Babylon. And what was their attitude supposed to be, in exile, in a society where they were exiles? They didn't speak the same language. They had nothing to do with it. They could have tried to infiltrate Babylon and use guerrilla tactics to take over, but what did God say to them? This is what He said to them in Jeremiah 29:7. God said this. He said, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile, and pray to the Lord. Pray to the Lord for it. Get the plan, because if it prospers, then you too will prosper. That is, I want you to seek the city of Babylon. Pray for it. Pray for the prosperity of Babylon. I want you to make it a great city to live in. I want you to make Buffalo a great city to live in. I want you to serve your neighbors in Buffalo, even though their language may be different, their beliefs may be different. They don't believe what you believe. I want you to serve the people. I don't want you to do this merely out of a sense of duty either. Pray for it is another way of just saying, love the city. Pray for it. Seek to make it a prosperous city, a peaceful city, a great place to live. Because if Babylon prospers through your service to it, then you will prosper too. For you, God says, the way to gain influence is not by taking power. Influence gained through power doesn't really change society. It doesn't change hearts at all. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on today that isn't changing my heart at all. God is saying, I'm calling you to a totally different approach, people of Res Life. I'm calling you to be so sacrificially loving, be so humble and willing that the people around you who don't believe exactly how you believe will soon be unable to imagine the place without you. They'll trust you because they see that you're not only out for yourself, but you're out for them too. When they voluntarily begin to look up to you because of the attractiveness of your service to them, then you'll have real influence. That's what Jesus was telling them there. And that influence will be an influence that is given to you by others, not taken by you from others. And who's that model of gaining influence that way? It's Jesus Himself, of course. How did He respond to His enemies? He did not call legions of angels down to fight, although He could have. He died for their sins. He gave Himself. And as He was dying, He even prayed for them. And if at the very heart of your worldview is a man dying for His service, then the way you're going to win influence in society is through service rather than power and control, which really may be way more difficult than it looks, because people always look for ways other than God's way to, be happy. And real quick, I want to talk about a New York Times article about Happiness 101. It's describing positive psychology. It's a branch of psychology that seeks to take a scientific, empirical approach to what makes people happy. And researchers in this field found that if you focus on doing things that give you pleasure, it does not lead to happiness, but it produces what one researcher had called the hedonic treadmill. And hedonism, or hedonistic, is just pleasure. FOMO, YOLO, fear of missing out, you only live once. All that means is you get addicted to pleasure, and you need to keep that pleasure fix going and going and going. You're never satisfied. You're never really happy. And according to this article, studies have shown the best way to increase your happiness is actually to do acts of self-kindness, selfless kindness, to pour yourself out for people in need. They're right there. They're right there. There's a guy, John Edwards, an old fella. He wrote a book called The Nature of True Virtue. He addressed something like this in terms of unselfish acts many, many years ago in his book called The Nature of True Virtue. And I'm going to paraphrase this here because he uses the Old English there. But he said, if you don't believe in the gospel of grace, if you believe that you are saved only by your works, then you have never done anything for the love of others or for the sheer beauty of it. You've only done it for yourself. You haven't helped that proverbial lady across the street just for his sake, just for her sake, or in the end for God's sake. You've done it because then you can look yourself in the mirror and go, I'm the kind of person that helps old ladies across the street. I'm going to expect to get to heaven someday because I'm a good person. How good do you need to be? It's a question. How do we live this humble, willing, unselfish life? The answer is we need to look at Jesus. If he is indeed a willing and a humble substitutionary sacrifice, and he is, if he indeed has paid for our sins with his own precious life, and he did, if he has proved to our insecure, skittish little hearts that we are worth everything to him, then we have everything we need in him, then it is all a gift of grace to us. We did nothing to earn this. And therefore, we don't need to do these things in order to connect to God or to feel better about ourselves. These things just bring about basically a meager upgrade to our own self-image compared with what we receive if we understand why Jesus died for us and how much he loves us. That's the important point. We need to understand why he did that. If we really understand what Jesus did at the cross, then we are blasted out into this world in joyful humility and willingness to serve. And there's one quote that I absolutely love. You've probably heard it a million times. You may have heard it from C.S. Lewis. It's a quote that says, humility is not thinking of yourself less, or thinking less of yourself. There you go. It's not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Now, bottom line, we can't be like Jesus in terms of what he did for us. And we do not need, we do not need to help people, but we want to help people based on what Jesus has done for us. To resemble and to represent the one who did so much for us. To bring him delight. Whether you think they are worthy of your service or not doesn't come into it. Don't even think that way. Only the good news of the gospel gives you a motivation for unselfish living that doesn't rob you of the benefits of unselfishness even as you engage in it. Finally, there was a guy called Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who was a German nobleman who was born into great power and privilege from 1700 to 1760, and he was one of the founders of what's called the Moravian Church. And because he was a count and a nobleman, he had lots and lots of money. And over the years, he spent his wealth down to practically zero doing good deeds and pouring himself out for others. Why? Not just so that he could get into heaven. Not just so that he didn't give away his money just so that he can get into heaven. It doesn't work. What happened to him that moved him so radically? And you should really look up this picture and Google it or whatever, because there's a couple stories about it. It's really cool. Nicholas von Zinzendorf, as a young man of 19, was sent out to visit the capital cities of Europe in order to complete his education. And one day, he found himself in the art gallery of Dusseldorf, gazing at Domenico Fedi's portrait entitled Ecce Homo. There it is up on the screen. It's a portrait of Jesus wearing a crown of thorns. And underneath the painting, you can't really see it, but underneath the painting, the artist had penned an inscription. He wrote an inscription, words that Jesus might say to any one of us. Those words underneath that so moved Nicholas von Zinzendorf that he gave away his entire fortune, like the rich young ruler who walked away sad. What it says at the bottom of this, he said, "All this I did for thee. What doest thou for me?" All this I did for thee. What doest thou for me? Let me pray for you. Father, your love is absolutely amazing. And Jesus is and was a willing and humble sacrifice. Not only was he a willing and humble sacrifice, but he is and was an example in how to live and how to serve others and how to love others willingly and humbly. And as we focus on this week going forward, he didn't have to die for us, but he wanted to die for us. We don't serve him just to get into heaven. We serve him out of a relationship. We do this. We believe in Jesus, who he is and what he did for us. My encouragement to you today is put your faith in him. Put your hope in him. Put your trust in him. Follow him with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And as you reflect this week, and that's a good thing to do, as Greg said, read the seven chapters in Matthew. Just read about this week. As you reflect this week on the sacrifice, I encourage you to join us next week to celebrate the resurrection, because it is the greatest day in history. It is the greatest day in history. All this I did for thee, Jesus said, what doest thou for me? God bless.